I want to begin today by thanking Rosemary Moore and Sarah Bond for their heroic work in making this conference happen, and Corey Brennan and all the other people at the AAH and the University of Iowa. Today I want to talk to you about a new approach to an old problem. I'm a huge believer in the future of humanities as a collaborative effort, just like the social and hard sciences are today. And I want to show you an example of that today. Corpus linguistics is a burgeoning field. And by corpus linguistics, I mean you take some natural language and you take texts from that language and derive a set of abstract rules about how it functions, descriptive rules. Then you use these rules to compare across languages and to study linguistic analysis of the language itself, stylistics, prose development, train computers to learn languages, do historical analysis of change over time, pedagogical uses, all kinds of things. So I've been working for many years in collaboration with my husband, Robert Gorman, also a classicist. And in our co-authored book, Corrupting Luxury in Ancient Greek Literature, we explored questions of author attribution, particularly about the fragments of the Hellenistic historians in Athenaeus. And we did this using hardcore philology, drilling down into the meanings of words by looking at every single use of these words, a kind of microanalysis. Well, now, for the last 6 years, we've been retuning. We have gone from microanalysis to macroanalysis. We've gone to what is called corpus linguistics. So to do this kind of work, which is to say big data study, one thing you need is data. And so I've been spending the last 6 years assembling a repository of hand-annotated Greek prose using Arethusa on the Perseids website. And he spent the last 6 years learning the computer statistics program R and how to manipulate data to make it more doable so that, for example, you can run an algorithm without taking your computer 3 days. And we've done some publications with preliminary works, and I want to especially bring your attention to his 2019 article, which I'm going to reference in a minute. And we've had pretty good results at identifying authors using just grammar. Now, the question, I wanted to apply this question to real problems, and one of the problems is the authenticity of Xenophon's Cyropaedia 8.8, a problem suggested to us a few years ago by Michael Flower. The prevailing view seems to be that it's genuine, but it's been challenged over time, beginning in the 18th century. And now I found also a dissertation from 2013 in which Field applied a digital analysis, but using vocabulary to decide that, in fact, Xenophon was the author of this passage. But the problem with vocabulary, or what are called n-gram studies for Greek, are that they don't necessarily work so well. If you are writing on the same subject, for example, then you're not going to get much variation. And Ader did a big study that shows this. He looked at a lot of different languages and especially a lot of texts in Greek, and he used both contiguous passages and what are called bag of words, where you grab passages or words at random. And his conclusion is that less than 2,000 words are not very useful. Even above 2,000 words, his accuracy rate hovers between 80 and 90%. And lower than that, and it simply falls off a cliff. So the basic problem we have here is that the Cyropaedia 8.8 is only 1,400 tokens. So it's not going to be a real good way to decide it. So we instead decided to approach the same kind of problem in the same kind of methods, but using syntax alone. So I used Arethusa on Perseids, and I made Greek trees. And this is a very simple program you can use for students. You can use for all kinds of things. I think it's amazing. Where you identify the lemma, you identify the part of speech, you identify what words depend on other words by hanging them, and you identify the relationship itself. So predicate, The verb here I've highlighted. We have a coordinator hanging on it and predicate nominatives hanging on it. We have the subject here. And the HTML code behind this is pretty simple because even I can understand it, and I am not a computer jock. And so we decided what you see here is each document gets its own ID. So this is the Cyropaedia's unique identifier. Each sentence gets a unique identifier. Each word gets a unique identifier. And then you get the form, the lemma, the part of speech, the relation, and what it hangs on. And we kind of took this information and just arbitrarily decided to grab each word and its parent and just look at part of speech and relation. That's it. So we took these 4 groups of information, which have many millions of possible combinations, and approached it in several different ways. So the first thing we did was just throw the hunks at the computer and let it see if there's any pattern. And this is just a kind of clustering into what's called a dendrogram based on the Agnes algorithm, which is commonly used. Used 13 prose texts that had at least 20,000 words treed by me, so there's not a lot of variation in user. And you see, with all of these texts, and use this method where we separated them into 400 word hunks, so not very big, and let the computer just decide what looked like each other without teaching it anything. And the result is not very sophisticated, but it lets you see if it's worth pursuing. And in this case, what we got was this tree. And the way you read this tree is the further up the division, the more dissimilar the groups are. So this group over here is the most dissimilar to this group over here and on down. So these 2 works are very near each other. These 2 works are very near each other. Now you see we have kind of a really predictable clustering. Polybius, Diodorus, and Dionysius together is the biggest group. We have Thucydides by himself, but he's closer to the orators than he is to some of the rest of the historians, which are grouped in interesting ways. Xenophon's problematic. He occurs both with the orators and with the historians, but we're going to talk more about him in a minute. But we get, as I said, kind of predictable divisions, which means that there is a great deal of merit in this approach. Why are Appian and Josephus in another group? I don't know. That's a future study that we haven't even begun. But what gets really interesting is if you add Cyropaedia 8.8 as a separate file, and we're calling him author X, run the same dendrogram, and suddenly, not only does he not group with Xenophon, but he doesn't even group with anyone else in these 13 texts. The computer finds him more different from everyone else than anyone else on here, and very, very much more different because this line is really long. So there is something really wild going on here. And so it's worth spending some more time. And we did a second method of classification, which is to train the computer on 90% of the text and then run it on 10%. And you do this division 10 different times at random and run it 100 different times. And so you get a lot of data here, right? And this is what Bob's done in his 2019 article, using the same 13 prose authors, though not the Cyropaedia, it wasn't done yet, and let the computer sort things out. And the results were, again, kind of remarkable. When he used texts in 2,000 word hunks, there were no errors. And the error rate stays pretty much 0 until you get down below 700 words. Then it becomes a fraction of a percentage. And you have to go below 300 words before it drops below 99% accuracy. And even then, with 50 words grabbed at random, we have an 84% accuracy rating. And this is just taking part of speech and relation of a word and its parent. Just to give you a comparison, our graph is the green line up in the top left corner of Ader's graph. So you can see we are much, much more accurate than the vocabulary method. So what if you run Cyropaedia against these other authors? What kind of results are you going to get? Well, Bob divided it into hunks down to 300 words and ran it against these same authors, adding in the Cyropaedia, books 1 and 8. And something interesting happened. Starting at 2,000 words, going to 300 words, author X, Xenophon Cyropaedia 8.8, was never assigned to Xenophon. The computer had to choose between these authors. It couldn't say somebody else. So it had to choose somebody, and it always chose Thucydides. I don't know exactly how to interpret that, except to say that author X is unlike the rest of books 1 and 8 of the Cyropaedia, and of our tested authors, he's most similar to Thucydides. So, what if we look at contiguous text instead of bag of words selection? So what if we do what's called a rolling window? We take a hunk the size of 8.8, which is 1,400 words, start at the beginning of the text and grab the first 1,400 words, shift it 10, shift it 10, shift it 10, connect the end to the beginning like a snake swallowing its tail so you can always get these hunks, and then compare that window to the rest of books 1 and 8. And you get a graph that looks like this. So 1.8 is very high, which means it's very dissimilar to the rest of the work. There's a couple of other things I want you to know. Sorry, 8.8. 1.2 here is even more dissimilar, and 1.2 is where he talks about the Persian education system. And we're going to call him author Z. The rest of this is pretty much normal. It gets high here. And I'm not going to worry about that so much because we did a second test where we took this rolling window and compared it not to the rest of books 1 and 8, but just to section 8.8. So how similar is it to 8.8? And of course, 8.8 is the same as itself, so it sinks down here. But these have the same bumps, and so something else is going on there we'll look at later. But what's interesting is here where we cross the line. Right? Where the lines cross, it gets really interesting. So let's look at this represented a different way by a heat map. And in the heat map, you can see anything red is the same, anything blue is very, very dissimilar. White is in between, but closer to red than blue. And if you compare author X and author Z, then you see they're very, very different from the rest. This is the same information, just given with a different kind of visual. So you can see that this is really interesting. What if we go back to our old friend, the dendrogram, and put author Z, section 1.2, in there as well? It not only doesn't think it's Xenophon, but it groups it with author X, and groups it quite significantly with author X. So we can definitely conclude that author X is unlike the rest of books 1 and 8, except that 1.2 is more like 8.8 than it is more like the rest of books 1 and 8. Are they written by someone else? If I had to bet on it, I'd say yes. And there's a really good chance they're written by the same someone else. However, the next question becomes, within this new field of study that we're basically making up as we go along, what is normal variation within one author? So he ran the same chart on book 1 of Thucydides, book 1 of Herodotus, the first 2 books of Polybius. And you see that we also get some pretty high hunks. We get some pretty high peaks. And what I did, I looked these up, and what I found was Herodotus is a section that talks about the Ionian cities. Polybius is an aside on food production and geography in Cisalpine Gaul. Thucydides isn't so much an aside. Remember, the Cyropaedia is an aside about the education system. Thucydides is the passage about the Spartan king Pausanias getting locked up in the temple and brought out right as he dies. So it's the death of Pausanias. So there might be something about asides that causes this to happen. So this might be normal variation. So, like so many good investigations, what we got may be more questions than answers. There's a lot of directions we would like to go in, and we have to just kind of pick and choose. We're very interested in looking at stylistic variations within one author, especially one who writes in multiple genres, and Xenophon's an obvious choice for this. Plutarch as well, but he's not as interesting to me because I'm more interested in the classical era. Another approach is to look at speeches versus narrative within one author, like Thucydides. So I'm going to go through and tag the different kinds, and we're going to compare them together. Something that Bob is working on is author attribution studies in multiple languages. So he's using these same methods and applying them to other languages with pretty good results. Now, he has to use computer parsed trees, which are not as accurate, but the results are better than you would expect, especially on a not very inflected language like English. It's very good with Finnish because that's incredibly inflected. And also, I'm in the process now of treeing the pseudo-Demosthenes orations that are attributed to Apollodorus, and I want to compare them to similar orations in Demosthenes. You can also use this method to look at prose composition questions, to drill down and figure out what are the specific characteristics that the computer is using to distinguish between authors. For example, does Herodotus like to use a prepositional phrase as the object of his verb in a way that distinguishes him from Thucydides? You can look at stylistic variations over time. I think that you're going to see a lot of influence of Latin style on late Greek. I see it when I'm treeing the Greek, so I know it's there. It just needs to be investigated. Computer language learning, the computational linguistics people are all over this kind of work, and are happy to have hand-analyzed prose, hand-annotated prose, I should say. I'm using it in pedagogy. I invite you to look at the class I am building right now, that is an online open access course in Attic Greek based on the principle of don't memorize dumb stuff. And I just want to finish by collecting some bibliography that I've already mentioned for the most part. The item in red is something new, which is a data article explaining how you can use dependency trees in various kinds of research. Thank you for listening. Thank you again to the Association of Ancient Historians for making this all possible, and be well.